Alright, short story, Suffer the Harpies by Jesse Ard. I love getting away and going for a stroll to clear my head, and on this particular day it was very early, as I had decided after a strong cup of coffee to hit the trail a good couple of blocks away from my home, which leads to a body of woods that I haven't quite had the time to explore as thoroughly as I've desired to. But for me, that is just as fine, because it gives me something to look forward to. I'd spot a trail or two and mark them in my mind's eye, to come back another dreary, overcast day that makes the green of the trees and foliage just pop out to my wondering eyes in all its magnificence and beauty, exuding nature's magic upon my imagination, commencing my mind to daydream that I am sauntering among some strange, majestic hinterland in Ireland, or meditating in some ancient, stark, yet beautiful forest in England, where maybe the Druids or some other ancient folk have dwelt many moons before me. Before I go any further into this reflection of what happened to this terrible predator of a man that I happened to come across in the deep mist of the dawn, I must tell you that I'm far from a talented writer. I don't ever own a journal, although I do read a great deal of novels and poems that I hope will aid me in my description so far, and on to the end of this day that the veil of reality was torn before my very eyes, which I am reliving on this here paper that my rigid and dexterous hand scribbles upon in the cold dead of night. I have to write this down in the simple hopes that clearing my mind, getting it off my chest, cleaning the mental slate, if you will. And so, to continue where I left off, I was happily trudging down the trail of the forest and admiring either side of the deeply wooded landscapes with imagination all my own, my thoughts randomly touching on all walks of the supernatural. A covenant of witches far off within, beneath the gloom of the trees, with the wild, stringy hair of old druids and ghastly gray faces, uttering an ancient dead tongue long forgotten. I dazedly walked on, and daydreamed myself happening upon a hollow with great huge oaks, garnished with Spanish moss, swaying sleepily in a warm, sweet breeze. And there, perched on a log, with his great black hooves and lithe, muscular legs, clad in midnight fur, is the Old One, the bard of spring, that mysterious satire of the wood, Pan. Within my reverie I imagine what beautiful yet terrible sounds would be borne forth from those hollow wooden pipes. So as you can see, I've read way too many classic horror novels, mixed with an overheated imagination such as mine. You can mentally create all types of dark, whimsical shit. Finally, the trail veered to the right in a cove, no, excuse me, in a curve and widened into the clearing. I walked slowly out to the middle and glanced about, enjoying the great outdoors and fresh air, when I suddenly paused to a far-off sound, very faint, coming farther back the distance from where I've just come. I turned, stood perfectly still, and listened. In a few moments the muffled sounds became footsteps, and then another sound manifested right along with the first, to which in another few short moments I took to be whistling. Someone was coming. and from the sound of his or her long, hasteful strides, we would soon be face to face within a few seconds. Naturally, I would have thought nothing of this situation and would have started my day back down the trail and meet my fellow hiker head on and exchange quick pleasantries with a smile and a wave and saunter on about my business. But for some strange reason, my intuition screamed for me to hide and hide well. The feeling was deep and primitively ingrained, urging every fiber of my being to take heed. Feeling extremely trepidatious and yet silly, I gave into the inner voice and stepped off across into the shady foliage, a good 10 feet, and squatted between an old oak and huge bush, eyes wide and watchful, staring across into the clearing. I felt like a fool. I didn't understand why I felt such imminent danger. It's as if the air in the atmosphere suddenly became very thick. Actually, I remember that it became very hard to breathe. My heart started to escalate like the rhythm of a speed bag, and the overcast sky portentously crept into an orange-red tint that transformed such a beautiful, enchanted forest into a treacherous place of shadow to be avoided, an evil and tenebrous landscape that only a monster completely devoid of human fears could love and call home. I looked about this spectacle of sudden change with fearful alarm when suddenly the figure of a man stepped into the clearing from the trail and stopped to take in the scene himself, and my heart froze when his eyes darted in my direction and paused for a moment. A short, bald, portly male with a brown carpenter's jacket, faded blue jeans, and a casual hiking boots. I sat rigid and regarded him closely and let out a long, relieved sigh when he looked away and to his left, when from within his jacket he produced a small trouble, slowly stepping into the foliage completely opposite and across from me. He stepped in a few feet and I could still clearly see him. My curiosity was locked completely, intrigued on what he was about to dig up. The right side of his body was facing me, while in the labors of his shallow digging, it wasn't long till he extracted and held up before his eyes a human skull. I couldn't believe what I was witnessing. I mean, there I was, out there, in the lonely woods, with some psycho that was feeling nostalgic and decided to visit one of his victims' shallow grave and reminisce on what a great and sick time he had, the twisted fuck. And that's when I noticed, once I zeroed in closer, that he was holding a child's skull. A poor, tender, sweet, and innocent child fell victim under those accursed hands that belonged to that loathsome monster in a human form. Then I noticed with horror and disgust that he was hungrily kissing the open jaws of his ill-begotten prize, all the while gripping and stroking his manhood between his squatted legs, when a great and terrible inhuman wail burst forth. It seemed from the coldest pit of some unknown hell, the pitiful excuse for a human shot to his feet, with his pathetic prick at half-mast under his jeans. I'll never forget that. And I'll also never, in all my paranoid and broken life, ever forget what happened next. My sanity utterly crumbles and weakens to dust, leaving me a mumbling fool crouching in a dark corner somewhere from just the thought of those detestable ancient creatures of pain. And the shit about this whole morbid deal is that I had already knew what these mythical beings of vengeance were. My chance with certain aspects of literature and role-playing games that I came across as a child that aided me in the knowledge of these ferocious monsters. With the body of a huge prehistoric eagle and the head of a human woman with a frightening sneer, along with terrible, glowing, wide, watchful eyes that seem to claim to curse you for ever existing. Another blood-curdling wail like the war cry from a demon cut through the surrounding air and into the middle of my very brain, rattling my teeth, causing me to cover my ears in sheer terror. I sat frozen, my eyes following the man panically burst forth through the foliage, skull discarded and forgotten. I couldn't move, let alone flee, for fear I being seen by whatever god-awful thing that was making those frightening sounds. The child murderer was making his way towards the trail when he suddenly stopped and screamed at the top of his lungs, face turning ghost white, staring at whatever horror was making its way down the trail towards him. All the while I was hearing wings upon enormous wings flapping everywhere and nowhere, as if slowly manifesting out of some unknown existence cast away and long forgotten by God himself, followed by another painful, ear-shattering screech. One of the beings, for all I felt there were many, appeared at the entrance of the clearing, blocking the stranger's way for escape. To the trail, in my shock, I had immediately recognized as, or what I thought to be, the mythical harpy. My very body and soul trembles when I think back to the moment my eyes beheld this abomination standing before its prey. A blustering wind began to blow as if from every angle, making the trees sway back and forth in unison, starting the leaves to whisper and liking to a ritual. Hair blowing wildly, a huge sharp beak protruded and shot forth from between the human teeth, stretching the woman's jaws into a grotesque yawn. The child killer screamed at the top of his lungs again, ringingly high-pitched like a girl in the throes of a nightmare. The hoary beast sprang and raked its huge claws swiftly down the side of the man's head, immediately slicing his left ear off and gashing his shoulder to rags in the process. Hand pressed to the side of his head, he turned and tried to run away, even though where he was going was completely opposite of the trail. The beast just stood there in complete confidence that the worm wasn't escaping the eagle, and just before the man left the clearing, two more of the feathered nightmares dropped out of nowhere and began to just maul the killer, ripping, slashing, biting, and pulling apart flesh. All the while the predator, now prey, screamed with terror and agony. One fury gripped a forearm within its gnarly talon. Bones snapped like kindling, while the other did the very same to the second arm, and held fast. And the screaming, the god-awful blood-curdling screaming that shattered my very soul and blasted my sanity. Crushed arms gripped like a vice. They slowly started to rise, and roughly 15 feet in the air, the killer jerked and squirmed, but to no avail. His nose was suddenly bit and ripped off by the third harpy. Flapping in the air, suspended, facing the killer, it suddenly raked its claw talon diagonally and completely across his stomach, blood raining down from the crimson gash. I nearly fainted, but the feathered monster wasn't done. It punched its claw through the dripping wound and took hold of the man's intestine and began to fly and fly, up and away over the trees with it like a bloody ribbon in the sky. It screeched its last demonic war cry in the clouds and disappeared. I turned to see the last two harpies holding their bloody trophy. One was ripping off the man's cheek with its hawk-like beak and paused to swallow. The other watched the child killer's intestines snapped loose from his ragged womb. Its beak must have slid back down its gullet because that ancient mysterious beast was smiling, gazing up in the sky, face stained with blood, and the most hideous grin I've ever seen in my life will forever be in my nightmares till I leave this earth. The face of a human snake with stringy flowing hair was what it looked like at that moment, with ripples in the cheeks and the eyes shining like $2 silver. It smiled in the throes of its bloodlust, then suddenly screeched that terrible god-awful wail, then just poof, blinked out of existence, leaving just a gust of wind in the trees. I'm sorry to cut this short at the end, but my hand is aching terribly and the shadows in the dimly lit room is starting to really bother me. My mind wandering to dark places. Subconsciously, I'm always terrified. I wish I could tell you who the child was, or what happened to the skull, and why the Furies mysteriously delivered their dark justice at that time. With all the other inhuman monsters out there that didn't have the pleasure to get done of their own medicine. It's also very hard to follow up on anything when you're so paranoid you don't want to deal with anything. I'm a hermit. My reality has been totally flipped upside down that I can hardly cope lately. But I won't bore you. I guess I feel somewhat better for writing this out, but not really. If those horrible beasts exist, then dear God, what else is out there?